Welcome everyone to this book launch of Dr. Huw Bennett. It is absolutely wonderful to see so many of you here today to celebrate this wonderful achievement of Dr. Bennett with also two amazing experts in the field of Northern Ireland and Northern Irish politics, Dr. Thomas Lee and Dr. Eleanor Williams, which will tell us why everyone interested in Northern Ireland politics and British politics on Northern Ireland should read this wonderful gem. Now, before we get into the depth of our discussion, I would like to introduce the panel and say a few words about the author of this amazing book. As you know, my name is Dr. Giada Lagana. I am a Leverhulme postdoctoral fellow and a lecturer in politics in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Cardiff University. Since 2022, I also have the immense honor and pleasure to be the president of the Irish Association for Contemporary European Studies, which is organizing this event. Joining today are Dr. Thomas Lee, senior lecturer in politics at Cardiff University and an expert on the intelligence war against the IRA and the Northern Ireland conflict's legacy issue in the Republic of Ireland. Dr. Eleanor Williams is a junior research fellow in the Northern Ireland peace process at Pembroke College, Oxford University. She's currently looking at the secret role of civil servants during the peace process in Northern Ireland, and she's also part of the Quill project Writing Peace, penning the Good Friday Agreement team. Finally, a few words on the author of the book, Dr. Huw Bennett. He joined Cardiff University in February 2016 as a reader in international relations. He specializes in strategic studies, the history of war and intelligence studies, and work on both historical and contemporary issues concerning the use of military power. Uncivil War has been published by Cambridge University Press in August 2023. And it shows how the army's ambivalent response to loyalist violence undermined the prospect for peace and heightened Catholic distrust in the state. We have experts to discuss the contents of the book, hence it is not my role to say anything more about it. But as I said, I instead would like to spend a few words on Dr. Bennett as a junior colleague, and I hope also as a friend, not just as a scholar. Now, I met Dr. Bennett for the first time in 2018, as he was chairing a panel where I was presenting a paper based on my recently finished PhD dissertation. I was incredibly intimidated as I was struggling to find my academic voice, and I was a little bit lacking confidence. Dr. Lee introduced us, and after my presentation, I found myself talking to Dr. Bennett about how my paper could develop into a new research project. Over the whole summer, we were regularly in touch, and he probably did not know at that time, but the only reason I did not purchase a one-way ticket back to my village in Italy was because I felt that if someone as good and as reputed as Dr. Bennett was believing in me, maybe I was not such a lost cause. And eventually that project never got funded, but I learned a great deal about how to write a research grant, and especially I did not lose hope. And it is important, I think, to highlight also this part of the work of great scholars, because certainly writing amazing books and doing impressive impact work is important, but there is also the invisible impact, the invisible part of the job, which is the impact that you have on people and students. And I really also want to remember the impact that Dr. Huw Bennett has had on many colleagues, myself very much included. Now, without further ado, I want to leave the stage to Dr. Lee, Dr. Williams, and Dr. Bennett. Our discussants will make some initial remarks and ask a question to Dr. Bennett, Bennett will subsequently answer before then leaving the stage to everyone that wants to ask a question. As household rules, I would ask to please include or put your question in the chat, and you will be, if you wish, then unmuted and you can ask your question aloud. Thank you so much to our discussion and our discussant, and I leave to you the stage.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Giada, and Noswaitha. Good evening, everyone, and I hope you're well. And just thanks very much for Giada, Huw, organising the event, having me on the panel this evening. And it's definitely a great privilege to be speaking to you about this, in my view, what's a really groundbreaking book, packed full of important analysis and ideas about what the British military were doing in Northern Ireland up to from the 60s right up until 1975 period, but also what they weren't doing. And Giada touched on that at the beginning of what she was saying, and who they were acting against and who they weren't acting against at different times. And really, we're talking to here the years that shaped the rest of the conflict, really. So it's really important in terms of what the military were up to. What I'm going to do in my contribution is three things. First, I'm going to provide background on Huw writing the book, just from my perspective. I've known Huw for various years, probably about 10 years now overall. Second, I'll discuss what I see as two important themes emerging from the book. And then I'll ask Huw a question as well at the end of my contribution before passing to Dr. Williams. So first up, background to Huw writing this book. So as I said, I can only comment on this from my own perspective and knowing Huw. So I've known Huw since, and he might correct me if I'm wrong with this, I think it's about 2013, so it's 10 plus years. And I remember early on when he was discussing writing the book and beginning it, he was at the International Relations Department in Aberystwyth University. And I remember chatting to him about the book project he was undertaking. And what made me kind of think, even at that early stage, that this was going to be a groundbreaking book that was packed full of important ideas. So I read this excellent journal article he did about how the British military had various out-of-court settlements for various complaints that were made against them, largely by national civilians in the north in the initial years of the conflict. And I'd never really read anything like that before, so it kind of stood out to me that, yeah, this is going to be a seismic book. It's going to be really, really important when it's published. I'd also read his book about the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya and how the British forces there attempted to deal with that. And that was also, and you can look into that in your spare time if you want to, very high profile research that linked into some public court cases, etc. So I definitely suspected from that background with Huw, this was going to be a good book and going to be detailed, and it was going to interact with public debates about the conflict in Northern Ireland. So Huw was then meticulously for various years covering as much archival and other materials as he could. And you can see that represented in the book. I mean, the depth of archival research is phenomenal in my view. And he would chat to myself and other colleagues about his work. Giada's mentioned this, and I think it's important to say with Huw as well that he's very generous with his time for others. I mean, this was a huge undertaking, this work. So it was a huge assistance to me. And Giada mentioned that a bit earlier when I was started work at Cardiff University 2016. And then also when I was in Galway for a while in 2017 before coming back to Cardiff. And when I was releasing my first book, 2020, with Cambridge, which was the intelligence war against the IRA. So Huw helped read through all that and then helped me amend that. But obviously, you know, as they say, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So I had to return the favor with this. So they gave me good insight into this book. And even just reading bits of the drafts, I knew this was going to be really important, picking up on key themes. So the point I'm trying to make with this rambling in the beginning is just, it's no accident or surprise to me and these colleagues here tonight that this book is gaining significant media attention, but also like academic attention we can see as well. And he's had nominations for various awards so far. And I'm sure that this will win some of those awards, and it's richly deserved. And as you know, as we talked about, he spent over a decade working on this project. And I think that's really ensured this is an important and quality publication overall. So then moving on to my second theme, which is looking at key themes from the book. So I'm going to cover two. So the first one, and I think really is the standout one for me, and Giada's already talked about this, and the most important theme from the book is about Ulster loyalist Protestant paramilitaries. And throughout his book, he makes it absolutely clear that he doesn't really feel the British Army nor the British government, so the two entities, but particularly the British Army, did all they could to take on Protestant loyalist British paramilitaries. So principally here, we're talking about Ulster Volunteer Force and then the Ulster Defence Association, or the Ulster Freedom Fighters, which was, in theory, their arm wing, but they're basically the same thing. So what Huw suggests is that this was not actually, in his view, because of any pro-unionist or loyalist bias, like any kind of sentimental attachment between the British government and British Army and the British military in particular. What he's saying in the book is particularly born out of a determination by the British Army to resist putting any more resources and time than was minimally necessary, as they saw it, into north of Ireland or Northern Ireland. And interesting for me that in other pieces of work that I'd done previously, I got the impression this might be because of NATO commitments. So, like in West Germany, because of the Cold War. And the British Army was concerned about pulling troops from there in case there was any like showdown at some point with the USSR. But Huw shows in his book that isn't the case. And actually, what he seems to find for the army hierarchy, they had real concern about constant tours in Northern Ireland was demoralizing soldiers and was keeping them from their families. And that really was kind of paramount in the British government and primarily the British military strategists' minds about why they didn't want to, as they saw it, like overcommit troops in Northern Ireland. So anyway, what all that meant is that there was this kind of fear of civil war, which the British Army and the British government both shared. And the consequence of that was that the loyalist threat by the British Army hierarchy was played down or overlooked at different times. And really kind of standout example, he talks about this in the book, is during May 1974. So what you get in May 1974, as many of you I'm sure know, strike held by loyalist and unionist Protestant politicians, loyalist paramilitaries, against the new power-sharing government that was dubbed Sunningdale, the Sunningdale government, because that's the name of the place that was signed, the agreement to create that institution. And Huw references quite fascinating accounts of how British Labour ministers, such as the Northern Ireland Secretary of State at that time, Merlin Rees, he wanted the British Army to intervene more against the strike, and they wouldn't do that for the reasons I've just explained. And what that meant was loyalist paramilitaries helped enforce the strike, which led to the end of power sharing. And in summary, really, British government impartiality and security policy is mentioned throughout the book as being questionable at best. And his book, therefore, is putting loyalists right back in the frame as a key contributor to the conflict's persistence alongside British military strategy, really for downplaying the loyalist threat and influence on what was happening. And it's interesting for me also, because I do work, and Giada mentioned that, about the Irish government's policies during the conflict, about how they dealt with conflict legacy since 1969. And you actually see this in Irish government files that are coming out, that they felt the British government at times was not doing enough on loyalism in the 1970s in particular, but that actually continues in the 80s and to an extent in the 90s as well. So that's one theme. The other theme that stood out for me was, let's call it the difficulties he faced with accessing military archives and papers. And he talks about that early on in the book. And you immediately get a sense of this theme by just reading the introduction and Huw's points about the MOD, it's the Ministry of Defence, and others delaying access to records or not allowing him to quote records in the book that he'd already been allowed to study. So kind of mad situation developing at times. And the kind of bonkers thing about that is that he says this, he can tell us more about, in examples, some of the things that are key, and I don't want to spoil some of the examples, but he mentions, for example, a few occasions, like the military's documentation that they were withholding him from using in the book that he'd already seen actually supports their version of controversial events. And what's really important in the sense he's saying here is, like, it seems to an extent almost the power over access to the military archives and documents is more important than even if it backs up their version of events. So it's a really interesting theme that comes out from the book. And he also says, it's quite hard, as he says, to know about the full side to some events, because like Royal Ulster Constabulary, so the RUC, the ex-Northern Ireland Police, their police records are generally closed, and it's the same with most intelligence records as well. So it's amazing the depth he's gone into this book, what's available. But he admits himself, there's still a lot of stuff we don't know because the other records aren't accessible. And the point with that, despite all that, and in spite of all the difficulties, he's produced for us a really vital insight into British military policy. And it also discusses some of the regional aspects of the conflict for the military, individual army units, and then loyalists and Republicans as well. And my own study certainly agrees that, for instance, the IRA and British Army strategy against each other in places like South Armagh was totally different than it was in Belfast, and there's multiple reasons for that. So, my overall impression and kind of final mark before I ask him a question with this is, this book represents for me like the highest levels of scholarship and writing, and very much to be commended. My question to Huw to finish is about regionality of the conflict, and to ask him, did he get the impression or the sense that the British military campaign between 1969 to 1975, was it varying in its strategy, successes and failures of those strategies due to British Army units involved and or the regions where they were operating, so places like Belfast, Derry and South Armagh? And that's it from me. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Thomas, and thank you for having me on this panel, Giada, and thank you for organising, and to IACES for organising as well. And it's a real delight to be here today to discuss such an important contribution to the field by a former colleague who, as Giada and Thomas have mentioned, is incredibly generous with his time and who's helped many within the field, including myself. So Uncivil War is by far the most comprehensive account of the Army's role during the Troubles in this period, and it's no wonder that it's received such widespread, warm reception on all kind of aspects of academia and in real practice, given Huw's years of meticulous research, dedication and balance with the topic. So I'm going to mirror Thomas's format, where I'm going to highlight two themes from the book that I found particularly interesting and key to bring out, and then I'll wrap my section up with a question. But before that, though, I know Thomas has already mentioned loyalism, but like Thomas highlighted, this factor is the most important theme in the book that I find. So I was just going to reiterate this briefly before I go into my own themes. And I thought this is a major contribution that Uncivil War makes by looking at the loyalism and providing a systematic assessment of how loyalism's political power impacted British strategy. Few accounts highlight the instrumental influence that hardline unionism had in this period, let alone in such detail. And I think that the fear that within the army and the British government had regarding facing possibly a two-front war, etc., and how that shaped so much what happening during this period, really kind of shaped British strategy. And this is, from what I know, has been completely overlooked in the literature before now, and indeed Uncivil War is a vital book in filling this gap. I know in the conclusion he asks for more research on this, but I do think he was really kind of given us the launchpad for further research by providing such a systematic account. And Huw's central arguments that British ministers, officials and soldiers were terrified of a descent into civil war, that the violence could spill over to British cities with Irish populations, and subsequently the fear of a Protestant backlash, and then provides much of a more nuanced insight to what was happening in the initial years of the conflict. And this fear of unionism, Huw argues, partly explains the short-lived honeymoon period in the Northern Ireland conflict. And indeed, he highlights that this broke down for three primary reasons, but that one of the main reasons was that the fear of the conflict within the majority population, as the unionists criticised the softy approach of the no-go areas. He also mentioned, such as the GOC was unwilling for its soldiers to be used as policemen, as another reason for why the honeymoon period kind of demised. And Huw mentions that the British Army's main error in the early 1970s was that it failed to reassure that they remained as impartial and able to protect ordinary Catholics from loyalist militancy. So I do think that is a really important contribution to the field that Huw makes there, and just kind of reiterating Thomas's points. But firstly, one of the two main kind of themes that I found particularly interesting was the impact that the conflict had on the British Army itself. And this was evident by the mid-1970s with recruitment. And I think it's interesting to see that there was pressure on the British mainland with campaigns such as Bring Our Boys Back from Ulster, and how that received over 40,000 signatures. And Huw even mentions that the bigger issue there was actually the declining re-enlistment figures by the experiences of soldiers. So like Thomas mentioned, that this was really particularly demoralising to the British Army. I thought it was even more interesting how even the tougher units, such as the Parachute Regiment, even began to question Northern Ireland Northern Ireland, as it was really kind of morally degrading their men. So like Thomas mentioned, again, being away from their families for long, extensive periods of time. I thought it was particularly interesting looking at the impact that this declining morale and the declining re-enlistment figures had on actual policy then, with Merlin Rees, the Secretary of State, wanting more emphasis on the police and taking pressure off the military. And due to the lack of morale, they actually had longer gaps in between the tours and significant pay rises, that this was necessary in the Northern Ireland conflict due to the impact it was having on the soldiers. And I think this is a vital contribution. It really kind of interested me because I think it's all too easy to look at actors such as the British Army as a homogenous entity and through an institutional lens and take the kind of human side of it out. And I think Huw successfully highlights, while still simultaneously providing a really systematic assessment, but still highlights the human dynamics of the British Army during the conflict, the impact on the spouses, their families at home. And it also highlights how different battalions within the British Army responded to the Troubles differently in a range of different ways, which leads me on to the next theme that I found particularly interesting. And this was the nuance within and between different units within the British Army during the conflict in Northern Ireland. So Huw highlights how the MOD left units to kind of attend to their own affairs. So for example, he mentioned how the Royal Scots produced fortnightly news sheets to keep their families back home informed. I thought this was just, not something that you hear in the common literature. And whilst the first Royal Greens arranged weekly briefings with the military wives to keep them more informed and to try and kind of improve morale. So I thought this was interesting how each kind of battalion had their own initiatives and freedom to do what they liked regarding this. But in more kind of serious matters during the conflict, Uncivil War also shows how the Parachute Regiment in Ballymurphy and the days surrounding internment opened fire on anyone in sight, whereas the Green Howards at the same time in the same city refrained from shooting anyone, even when they themselves were taking casualties. So even showing these kind of different nuances between different battalions during the same city in the same time, I thought was absolutely fascinating. And again, just showing more of an insight into how the British Army is not this one homogenous entity. And in Civil War actually also brings to light the broader tensions and nuance between the British Army and the rest of the British state, which I thought was really interesting. So for example, there were tensions between the Northern Ireland Office and the British Army during the 1975 ceasefire. Like Huw mentions, the army didn't like the fact that the incident centres that were set up during this time were receiving many complaints about them. And at a more senior level within the British Army, they struggled that the Northern Ireland office were actually dominating policy, and the army's wish to imprison as many Republicans as possible couldn't be reconciled with due to the Northern Ireland office's need to run down internment and to convince nationalists to engage in constitutional politics. So I thought this was really interesting, again, even at a more kind of British state level, that there were tensions and how things were happening during the kind of 70s. And as well as different levels of the British Army had different problems with the rest of the British state as well. And just before I get to my question, I wanted to quote an excellent sentence from the book, which I think just sums up the army experience and the Troubles more generally very well. And I've just underlined this several times. And I'll quote, "This book is a history about how a country and its army became entangled in a war when they could not bear to lose, but they were unwilling to pay the price to win." End quote. And I just thought that's an excellent quote just to summarize that experience. But finally, to end my part in this, my question to Huw links back to my final theme that I raised regarding nuances within the British Army. And that is, what impact did this haphazard nature of units having running their own affairs have on the Northern Ireland conflict? What impact did it have? But I'll end there and hand over back to Giada and Huw.
Lovely, thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. It's a real privilege to be speaking with you this evening. And thank you so much to Giada for organising and Alan for sorting out all the arrangements. I think I'm going to invite Giada to give my retirement speech. This is the loveliest tribute I've ever heard, so she's really taken me by surprise there. But I'll get straight onto the questions. So I think I'll start by answering that final question that Leah just asked about regimental differences. This is not a surprise to anyone who spends any time with the British military, that different parts of the army, as with the Navy and the Air Force as well, they've got their own subcultures and their own ways of doing things. And they really treasure that kind of degree of autonomy and the ability to shape their own behavior and cultures and so on. Now, I'll come on in a second to the downsides to that way of operating. But of course, for the British Army, both then and now, many people in the army would view that as a huge strength of the organisation, that it plays a really important part in motivation, in keeping soldiers going out, in the case of the Troubles, out on the streets in the middle of the night doing difficult things day after day, and that it brings a connection with the recruiting area as well back home. Something else that's very clear as well, before a lot of the processes in the sending of troops to Northern Ireland later on from about 1972 onwards, before they became evident, was that this autonomy within British Army regiments allowed quite a degree of creativity and innovation. So if you're looking at intelligence gathering techniques, for example, trying to understand the situation as it was in Northern Ireland, or training is another area, that this autonomy allowed some regiments to be really quite creative and to respond to things quickly rather than waiting for the chain of command to tell them what to do. So there were reasons why this persisted, because many in the army thought that this autonomy was a positive force. However, what this meant, in combination with the frequent rotation of units in and out of Northern Ireland, so of course they were on different tour lengths. So you could be there for a year or a year and a half on a residential tour, based in a pretty comfortable barracks and able to gain familiarity, some level of familiarity with the area and the people. Or you could be there for a much shorter period, even just a few weeks, if there was a real crisis and reinforcements were needed. But regardless of that, what this meant was that this frequent rotation in and out, where units would even be sent to different parts of Northern Ireland that they had no prior experience in, meant that there was a kind of a consistent loss of knowledge about the conflict and about the politics of Northern Ireland. And also fundamentally, as Leah was also getting at, it was very difficult for the British Army to fulfill one of the prime demands of, if you like, counterinsurgency theory, which is to build a strong relation with the population. You can't build a relationship with the population if you're not there for very long, if you're being moved in and out. And from the perspective of people living in Northern Ireland, having to put up with soldiers, interfering with their daily business and searching their cars and kicking the front door down of their house in the middle of the night and searching for weapons, this just lack of predictability in daily life was partly brought about by this regimental system. So there was significant negative consequences to it, as well as the positives. Okay, to me, and this goes to Thomas's question as well, to me, this regimental variation is possibly more important than the regional variation in the nature of the conflict when it comes to the British Army's conduct. Now, if we're talking about the actions of the IRA or the different tactics being used by loyalist groups, then that is probably not true. Then political geography probably matters a lot more than it did for the British Army. So institutionally, I think geography is less important than regiment, but in terms of the British Army interacting with those paramilitary groups, that's where geography, really comes into play a lot more. Okay, what do I want to add from this? So Yeah, the loyalist equation is really significant, and this is an area that I didn't set out to make a major theme of the book when I started it, but it became increasingly obvious as I went on and was going through the archive material that the loyalist groups were uppermost in the minds of senior British officers, senior civil servants, and political leaders in the UK as well. And really significantly, we're talking here not just about the use of force, the violence of loyalist groups, which of course was present from 1966 onwards. You know, it was a consistent issue. Not only the actual violence, but often the threatened violence as well. This was something that was as present in the minds of those decision makers as real violence taking place. So as Thomas mentioned, in the summer of 1972, there were a couple of incidents where the Ulster Defence Association, I think something like 3,000 or 4,000 men on the streets of Belfast nearly came to blows with regiments of the British Army, and these incidents were described as near disastrous confrontations, right? So that threat of the use of force was as significant in strategic thinking as the actual violence that was going on as well. Of course, there was some knowledge of loyalists, who they were. A certain proportion of those in loyalist groups had been in the British Armed Forces in the past, in the Second World War or subsequently. They had access to weaponry. There was a high ratio of weapons ownership amongst the Unionist and Loyalist communities in Northern Ireland. So the British Army was in some ways rightly concerned about the militant potential of these groups, right? The question is whether they should have done more about it or not, and that's up to the reader to decide that. So this is a major theme of the book. Where there's still a lot to be done, of course, because this would have to come from loyalist sources. You can understand the impact of loyalism on British thinking by looking at British sources. What we need to know a lot more about are the origins of loyalist thinking, the organisation of the loyalist groups, what their strategic thinking was, and so on. And the literature and our understanding of that is still limited, much more limited than our understanding of the Republican groups, which is more advanced. So there's a lot more work to be done on that front. I'm conscious of time and that you don't want to just hear me rambling on about all the details of my book, but you probably want to quiz me and challenge and criticize me. So I will leave it there and yeah, let our discussion flow. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Huw, and to our amazing discussants. This has been so interesting, and we have already several questions in the chat. Please all feel free to post more, or I'll simply abuse my role as chair and ask my own question. Now, I'll read the first comment that was posted in the chat, and it comes from a former civil servant in the Irish government, Paul Dwiffer, who is one of the most affectionate attendees of all IACES event. And he said, I was in Durham during the 70s at a regional conference, and while exploring the city, I came across the British Army recruiting office. I was very surprised at their pitch, which amounted to, come to Northern Ireland for the adventure. Given my own emotional involvement with Northern Ireland, I thought this obscene at the time. And then he moves on with a question. So then you can comment on both. And he asks, the perception in the South was that the Scottish and Welsh regiments were worst. Might there have been a justification for such an attitude? I think people down South probably thought the Celtic Scots and Welsh could be expected to be more sympathetic to the nationalist cause and population.
Great, thanks very much for those questions. That's a really fascinating insight on the recruiting situation. I think you do find this in general terms if you speak to people in the military who have any kind of experience of the recruitment process. is that, and this, you know, continues to the present day, when the army is not active, when there aren't operations going on, that's when recruitment problems can happen, because there's a certain, you know, proportion. I wouldn't like to say everybody, you know, has the same motivation to join the army, but a certain proportion of people who join any of the armed services, they want to do it because they want to see action, right? And they want to test themselves in the most difficult circumstances, and sometimes they quite simply want to be allowed to use violence in some way or another. So you do see that in the regimental, some of the regimental sources on Northern Ireland. There's a very sort of mixed feeling about the soldiers as a group, enlisted sort of junior soldiers. A concern about, like, at what point will they get sick of going to Northern Ireland, and will they stop will they stop signing on to renew their contract? Will they leave the army because they're sick of going back to Northern Ireland all the time? But also an understanding that you know, a certain proportion of soldiers were really quite happy to be there and found it very thrilling and enjoyable to be able to you know, beat people up and fire their weapons on occasion. The Scottish and the Welsh regiments, so that's fascinating. I've never heard this particular claim before about the Scottish and the Welsh being more brutal, with the exception, of course, of the Falls Road curfew in 1970, where in July 1970, where one of the regiments that was involved, I can't remember which one it was now, it was a Scottish regiment involved, which was accused of being very sectarian and of you know, going in and smashing up people's Catholic possessions and so on, and using a lot of verbal abuse on a sectarian basis. What I found in the archives was that particular regiment, which publicly denied that any of this happened, it did have an unusually high court-martial percentage in the months following, and a number of the soldiers who were present during the curfew were court-martialed for abusing the population. So it wasn't you know, it wasn't just kind of a Republican propaganda that this went on. It really did go on. So yeah, that's the kind of main instance that I've heard of this. There's a great book by our colleague Ed Burke at UCD called An Army of Tribes, where he looks at a couple of Scottish regiments, and so he really gets to this question of, were the Scottish regiments more violent? Were they motivated by sectarianism? He finds that some soldiers were, sometimes very, very violently, but that overall it probably wasn't a factor most of the time in most of the places where they were deployed. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Huw. There is another question from Jeffrey Dudgeon, and he asks, how did the army address the issues of 700 soldiers being killed in the conflict? Would that have had an effect on recruiting or morale?
Yes, that's a fantastic question, and something where there currently, as far as I'm aware, isn't any research, but where I've just had a PhD student complete her PhD looking at this issue. She looked at the army's handling of bereavement, of military bereavement in Afghanistan, and showed, you know, how, of course, what a hugely upsetting thing it is to have to deal with, the parts of the military who have to handle this issue, the family liaison officers who have to go and inform a military family, but that their son or brother or whoever it may be has been killed in combat, and then how that whole process of bereavement is handled by the army bureaucracy. You know, sometimes with a lot less sort of empathy than one would probably hope. As far as I'm aware, there hasn't been that kind of work done on the army in Northern Ireland. Like, how did it handle this process? What I conclude by the end of the book is that by 1975, the army had, or the Ministry of Defence, perhaps is a better way of putting it, had come to the conclusion that the army could sustain a certain level of damage to itself operating in Northern Ireland. So there was by that stage, there was a fairly sort of steady level of soldiers being killed, wounded, otherwise affected. And there was also a fairly steady pattern of people leaving the army because they were unhappy with it. And by that point in 1975, the MOD view was that this could be managed, right? That as long as the army continued to recruit new sort of 17, 18-year-olds, that a certain level of kind of attrition of the army's own ranks was manageable within itself. So Leah mentioned some of these methods that were invented. Again, what you see is in the early years, a lot of this is done by the regiments. Then later on, as the years go on, more of it is centralized, and there's a more kind of systematic approach where the same procedures are rolled out across all army units. Is that there were very deliberate attempts to try and keep up morale within the military family, if you like. So both the families of those who were serving in the army, but also the recruiting areas and the communities where lots of soldiers tended to come from. So there were like consistent attempts to protect that basis of recruitment into the army. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating. Now we have a whole set of questions that just came. So I'll ask two. You'll maybe take notes so that we can address them all. The first one, can you say more about government fears regarding to the extensions of the conflict to Great Britain? What was the basis of this fear? What options were considered as a response? And the next one, the bizarre rules around declassifying documents remain a great mystery. We have had files reclassified and withdrawn that we have already accessed. What's the logic? The regiment bias, there was definitely a sectarian issue with Scottish regiment. Pat, if you can center.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, on that last point, I mean, I don't dispute it, right? There is evidence of some sectarian behaviour by some regiments of the army. So, and of course, you know, my book goes up until the end of 1975. You've got many years after that where this is an issue that people had complaints about too. So, you know, I don't want to make like a definitive statement that they definitely didn't, you know, have a problem there, because there's plenty of time where that was playing out after the period that I cover. The same point applies to collusion as well, right, which we can also come on to. The point of the concern in the UK government and in the military about the conflict spreading to the mainland, if you like, this is, I think, definitely a significant factor in the thinking about the conflict throughout its duration. Now, what I would like to know crucially about that is, was this a realistic fear or was it exaggerated? And to really get to grips with this, I think we probably need access to three types of sources that are currently unavailable. So the first type of source would be the high-level intelligence assessments compiled by the Joint Intelligence Committee, which serves the British Cabinet and, if you like, gives a polished all-source intelligence product to the British government to then decide what to do with the information. So nearly all of these assessments on Northern Ireland are closed. So we don't know the real detail of, was this a realistic fear or was it a kind of panic that got out of control? The second kind of category of information that we don't have, of course, are the records of MI5. So MI5 was involved in things going on in Northern Ireland, for sure, but also responsible for internal security in the whole of the UK and keeping a very close eye upon the activities of any subversive or dangerous groups in British cities, right, from that might be related to all different parts of the conflict in Northern Ireland. And then the final category of information that we don't have are the files of those who, in practice, provide a lot of information to MI5, which are the British police forces, right? The special branches of the Hampshire Police, or, you know, whichever police force might be relevant. So they were collecting a lot of information too. So there's a huge aspect of the, well, there are many aspects, but this is just one aspect of the history of the conflict, the sort of the overspill to England and Wales and Scotland, and that is really poorly understood, because almost all of that information is still shut, which takes us on to this question about file classification, which I've had a difficult relationship with the MOD and the National Archives over many years, where there have been times where it's felt like the National Archives have been acting like a kind of a subsidiary of the Ministry of Defence, not as an independent organisation that is supposed to uphold the Public Records Act. I'm a great fan of the National Archives, but there are times where it's been very frustrating. And for sure, this has definitely happened. I can confirm this point about files being released and open to the public and then taken back. This happened with a lot of the files on the Ulster Defence Regiment, for example, which is, yeah, it's very problematic. Sometimes the files are called back in and then they're just kept. So they're reclassified and they're not available ever again. And sometimes they are reclassified and then they're partly released again. So whereas in the past you would be able to see, let's say, 100 pages, now when it's gone through the process again, you can see 50 pages or 30 pages instead. So I think what's been going on here is it's partly affected by litigation, by civil cases, by criminal cases, by inquests in the courts, where the Ministry of Defence has kind of worried that maybe they released too many archive papers in the late 90s and the early 2000s after the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, and they've sort of, in a mad panic, called things back in to check that they are happy with what they've released. So, from my point of view, I mean, there are legitimate grounds, of course, for why information should be retained and kept secret. At times it's necessary to protect people's lives, but in my experience, there's also a lot of over classification and over secrecy as well, which is effectively going to undermine the accountability of the British state. That's what this is really about. This archival type of research, it's about understanding what our elected representatives get up to and what the organs of the British state do. And if all the information is kept secret from us, then that's a kind of a major problem for the functioning of a democracy.
Thank you so much. So we still have time for a few questions. And so the next one, were you able to research the Army's relationship to Protestant loyalist unionist communities as distinct from paramilitaries, and how this differed to the military occupation of nationalist areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. I did up to a certain extent, but there's definitely a lot more to be done. And it's doing a book like this, one of your hopes at the end is that other people will be inspired by it and do work that's better, and they'll fill in all the gaps. So one of the gaps that is present in the book is certainly, if you like, the social history of the army. So I've already mentioned this issue of how the army as an organization dealt with bereavement, and like how much support did it give to military families, or how little, what did it do there? But there's also definitely a big question there, which has been partially answered in the past by people like Steve Bruce, writing about loyalism in Northern Ireland. He talks a little bit about the army's relationship. So, but there's definitely a lot more to be done on this. But I think it needs to come from, if you like, non-army sources, and a lot of oral history interviews with people in Northern Ireland, perhaps more than coming from British military records. But there is, I think, from probably 1972, when 1972, of course, is the most violent year in the history of the modern Troubles, there is often a sense of fatalism in British regiments. Not the same everywhere, but you see this kind of again and again, a fatalistic sense that the Catholic community are just you know, against the army. Whatever the army does, things had got so bad, the army's reputation had been so tarnished by its own actions and other things, that there wasn't much repairing that could be done, right? So this again goes to this point about, in theory, in counterinsurgency theory, the army should have been doing lots of hearts and minds activities and trying to win the population over. They do some of that, but they don't really make that much of an effort in Catholic areas, because there's often a feeling that there isn't any point, right? Now, they do make an effort in Protestant areas, but of course, one of the really, really significant decisions that's taken early on in 1969, in September 1969, by a brigadier, so it's not even a high level, the top level policy decision, is taken by Brigadier Hudson in Belfast, because it just seems sensible to him on a kind of practical level, is that an agreement with the police that the British Army will look after the Catholic area, mainly the Catholic areas of Belfast, with some exceptions, you know, for an emergency or here and there, and the police will look after the Protestant areas, and there's a division of labour, right? So this is then applied eventually pretty much everywhere in Northern Ireland. It's not such a stark contrast in the countryside, perhaps, as in the urban areas. But what it means is that when the British Army is trying to think about what it should do about rising loyalist militancy and the murder campaign, murder of Catholics at various points, they have a real intelligence shortfall because they're just not embedded in the right communities. They find it very difficult to understand what's going on in Protestant or loyalist areas because they don't have those connections that they might need. So this decision to kind of divide the labour of the army and the police between different communities was really fateful, and if you like, kind of pushed the army further down this path of confrontation with the Catholic community that may not have been so pronounced if there'd been attempts to spread them out on a more kind of equal basis.
Thank you so much. Now we have time, I think, for one last question, and I'll send to you the other question, or you can email him if you want, and I'm sure he'll be happy to answer. And I apologize for those who I haven't touched upon, but I'll just take the last one that was posted. So how did the army reconcile they were on Great Britain soil and waging a conflict with their citizens, irrespective of reality of identity? And to what extent did the institutional discrimination of Stormont government and policies became mirrored in how they approach their role towards nationalists not appreciating human rights?
Yeah, the brilliant question. Thank you very much. So I think this is one of the advantages of my book, of looking at different parts of the British Army, is that you really, and just accepting the basic kind of premise that I stole from Neil O'Doherty at Galway, that the army, as well as the British state, is kind of complicated, and that there are lots of different shades of opinion within any organization. Like, not everybody believes the same thing. And you definitely get that when you look at how soldiers talk about Northern Ireland, right? So even quite junior soldiers, like corporals, lance corporals, would sometimes write reflections, or they'd be interviewed for their own regimental magazine. You know, what do you think about the last 4 months that you've spent in this place? You know, what are your conclusions about it? And because these were written for like an internal audience, sometimes they were quite, you know, direct, and they weren't very diplomatic. And you've got a real split there between those who are kind of disgusted with what they've experienced in the conflict, and they're pretty keen on never going back to Northern Ireland, and they feel that there's this sort of historic enmity between the communities that will never be reconciled, and they're hugely pessimistic about it. And on the other hand, you have quite a few soldiers as well, again, all different rank level, you know, from junior soldiers right up to the generals commanding the army, who feel an affinity with Northern Ireland, and they do feel that they have a lot in common with people in Northern Ireland. They're basically the same as, you know, anyone else who lives in Liverpool or Bristol or wherever else. and that the British Army, have a moral obligation to try and help people escape from the scourge of terrorism, as many soldiers see it. So there's a real split there. I think at the higher levels of the UK government and the top ranks of the army, there is a belief that whatever the British government is doing from 1969 onwards is more liberal and more enlightened and more progressive than the state of affairs before the British intervened, and that there is a reform programme to get rid of gerrymandering in elections, to get rid of discrimination in housing allocation, so on. So you could definitely argue that the British elite are quite deluded in how they, expect people in Northern Ireland to receive their generous reforms, but they really do believe that they're pushing things in the right direction. What you don't see, of course, what people who live in Northern Ireland and are witnessing all this violence are not aware of, is that there are many instances where the British government from 69 onwards really turned down a lot of radical proposals that are coming out from loyalist groups and even the elected unionist government. So there are ministers in the Northern Ireland cabinet who are advocating that British soldiers should go onto the streets with heavy weaponry, with bazookas, heavy machine guns. They should declare kind of free fire zones like in the Vietnam War, and they should just open fire and mow people, basically calling for mass murder, right? There are people in government in Northern Ireland who are asking for mass murder. So the British government refused to authorise this. So in the minds of those leaders, they view themselves as very restrained, right? Which means that they find it very difficult to believe that anyone in Northern Ireland could accuse British soldiers of being brutal or of using too much violence. They just can't quite believe it because they think they have the best of intentions, right? Regardless of the reality of behaviour on the ground.
Well, I thank you so much because this was fascinating, and I would ask everyone to please join me in a big applause to Dr. Bennett, and please run to buy this amazing book that really will enrich all our libraries and all our knowledge. Thank you to everyone who has attended this event. As I said, the recording will be soon available on the IACES website and YouTube page. I wish you all a very good evening, and thank you again, Dr. Huw Bennett, for producing this amazing piece of work.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's been great speaking with you this evening. Great privilege. Thank you.
Goodbye.